They dragged me up the scaffold steps in chains so tight my wrists bled, and Emperor Valen stood on the royal balcony above the square, his laughter echoing off the stone like thunder. "A thief and a fool," he called out to the crowd, his voice rich with mockery. "This is what becomes of those who dare steal from the crown, worthless, forgotten, gone." The headsman raised his axe, the blade catching the afternoon sun, and I closed my eyes, bracing for the end. But when the steel kissed my neck, it didn't bite, it melted, pooling like liquid silver at my feet, and the square fell into a silence so deep I could hear my own heartbeat drumming in my ears. I'd spent the last 3 days in a cell that smelled of rust and urine, my back pressed against damp stone, counting the hours until they'd come for me. The guards never spoke, just shoved bowls of gray porridge through the bars and left me in the dark. On the morning of my execution, they hauled me out into blinding daylight, and I stumbled, blinking like a mole, my legs weak from disuse. The Capitol Square was packed, merchants and nobles, beggars and children, all craning their necks to see the thief who'd been caught red-handed in the imperial treasury. I wasn't a thief, not really. I was a scribe's apprentice who'd made the mistake of asking too many questions. My master, old Corwin, had been cataloging tax records when he'd stumbled onto something, numbers that didn't add up, shipments of gold that vanished into thin air. He'd whispered his suspicions to me one night over lukewarm tea, his hands shaking. A week later, they'd dragged him out of the shop in chains. I tried to gather proof, slipping into the Treasury archives late one night, but the guards had been waiting. Corwin never made it to trial. They said he'd hanged himself in his cell, but I knew better. The scaffold loomed ahead, a rough-hewn platform in the center of the square, its wood dark with old stains. The headsman stood at the top, his face hidden behind a black hood, the axe resting on his shoulder. Emperor Valen watched from his balcony, draped in crimson velvet, a goblet of wine in one hand. He was younger than I'd imagined, maybe 30, with sharp cheekbones and eyes like chips of ice. When the guards shoved me forward, he leaned over the railing, his smile wide and cruel. "Behold," he announced, his voice booming across the square, "the great thief who thought he could outwit the crown, a nobody, a grain of sand in the empire's shoe." The crowd murmured, some laughing, some silent. I felt their eyes on me, heavy and hungry, and my throat went dry. "Worthless," Valen continued, swirling his wine, "but useful as an example. Let this be a lesson, steal from me, and you will die forgotten." The guards hauled me up the steps, and I stumbled, my knees buckling. One of them caught my elbow, steadying me with surprising gentleness. I glanced at him, a young man, maybe 20, with a scar across his jaw and eyes that wouldn't meet mine. He said nothing, but his grip lingered a moment longer than necessary before he stepped back. The headsman gestured for me to kneel, and I obeyed, the wood rough under my knees. The block was still warm from the last execution, a farmer who'd been caught poaching deer in the royal forest. I'd heard his screams from my cell. Now it was my turn. I pressed my forehead to the wood, my breath coming in shallow gasps, and the headsman raised the axe. The crowd held its breath. The blade fell. I felt the cold kiss of steel against my skin, a pressure so light it was almost tender. Then heat, sudden and searing, and the axe dissolved. Liquid metal dripped down my shoulders, pooling at my knees, and I jerked upright, gasping. The headsman stumbled back, his axe handle empty, his hands trembling. The crowd erupted, voices rising in shock and confusion, and Emperor Valen stood frozen on his balcony, his goblet slipping from his hand to shatter on the stones below. I touched my neck, expecting blood, but my skin was whole. The molten steel cooled at my feet, hardening into a twisted, silver puddle. The chains around my wrists began to hum, a low vibration that climbed up my arms, and then they cracked, falling away in pieces. I stared at my hands, flexing my fingers, my mind spinning. The young guard who'd steadied me earlier took a step forward, his face pale, his lips forming a single word: impossible. Emperor Valen's voice cut through the chaos, sharp and commanding. "Seize him," he roared, "now." But the guards hesitated, their eyes wide, their hands hovering over their swords. The headsman backed away, shaking his head, and the crowd began to murmur, a low rumble that grew louder with every passing second. Someone shouted, "It's a sign." Another voice, trembling, "The old stories." I didn't wait to hear the rest. I bolted, leaping off the scaffold and into the square, my legs finding strength I didn't know I had. The crowd parted, some reaching out to touch me, others recoiling as if I carried a plague. I ran blindly, my heart hammering, the Emperor's furious shouts echoing behind me. I had no plan, no destination, only the desperate need to survive. Behind me, the scaffold groaned, and I glanced back just in time to see it kneel, the wood splintering and bending as if bowing to an unseen force. The headsman fell to his knees, his hands pressed to the ground, and the whispers began, soft at first, then louder, a chorus of voices that seemed to come from the stones themselves. "Welcome home, true king." I didn't stop running, but the words followed me, wrapping around my chest like a chain I couldn't break. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs gave out, collapsing in an alley behind a bakery, the smell of burnt bread thick in the air. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what had happened. The axe melting, the chains breaking, the scaffold bowing. It was impossible. I was nobody, just a scribe's apprentice with ink-stained fingers and a habit of asking the wrong questions. There was no magic in me, no royal blood, nothing that could explain what I'd seen. But the whispers had been real. "True king," the words echoed in my skull, mocking me. I pressed my palms to my temples, willing them to stop, but they only grew louder, a hum that vibrated in my bones. I needed shelter, food, time to think. The Emperor's guards would be scouring the city by now, and I couldn't stay here. I staggered to my feet and made my way through the back streets, keeping to the shadows. The capital was a maze of narrow alleys and crumbling tenements, a stark contrast to the gleaming palace district where Valen lived in luxury. I'd grown up here in the lower wards before Corwin had taken me in as an apprentice. I knew every shortcut, every hidden corner, and I used that knowledge now, weaving through the labyrinth until I reached the old quarter. The Church of the Forgotten stood at the edge of the ward, a squat stone building with a crooked bell tower and windows patched with mismatched glass. It had been abandoned for years, deemed too humble for the city's growing elite, but the priest, Father Morwen, had refused to leave. He was ancient, with a beard that brushed his chest and eyes like clouded glass, but he had a reputation for sheltering those who had nowhere else to go. I'd brought him bread once when I was a child, and he'd smiled at me, his voice gentle. "The forgotten are never truly alone." I slipped through the side door, the hinges groaning, and stepped into the dim interior. The air was cool and smelled of incense and damp stone. A few candles flickered on the altar, casting long shadows across the pews, and Father Morwen stood at the front, arranging wilted flowers in a chipped vase. He looked up as I entered, his expression calm, as if he'd been expecting me. "You've caused quite a stir," he said, his voice like gravel smoothed by a river. "The entire city is talking about the thief who couldn't be killed." I sank onto a pew, my hands shaking. "I don't understand," I said, my voice breaking. "I'm nobody, "Nobody is nobody," Morwen interrupted, setting down the vase and walking toward me. "Least of all you, boy." He studied me for a long moment, his clouded eyes narrowing. "You've felt it, haven't you? The humming, the pull." I nodded, unable to speak. He sat beside me, his joints creaking, and sighed. "There are old stories," he said slowly, "about a bloodline that was supposed to have died out centuries ago. A line of kings who could bend the world to their will, not through magic, but through truth. They could unmake lies, shatter false oaths, and command the very bones of the earth." He paused, his gaze distant. "The last of them was executed by the first emperor, his name erased from history. But stories have a way of surviving, even when the tellers are gone." I stared at him. "You think I think," Morwen said carefully, "that the world is stranger than we give it credit for, and I think you need to leave this city before Valen's men find you." Before I could respond, the door burst open and a figure stumbled inside, a woman, her cloak torn, her face streaked with soot. She collapsed against the doorframe, gasping for breath, and I recognized her. Alara, one of the market vendors who sold flowers near the square. I'd bought a sprig of lavender from her once, and she'd tucked an extra stem into the bunch, winking. "They're burning the lower wards," she said, her voice ragged. "Valen's orders. He says anyone who shelters the thief will hang." Morwen stood, his face grim. "How long do we have?" "Minutes," Alara said, "maybe less." She looked at me, her eyes wide. "They're calling you a demon, a false prophet. Valen's scared, and scared emperors do terrible things." I felt the weight of her words settle over me like a shroud. People were suffering because of me, because of something I didn't understand and couldn't control. I wanted to run, to disappear into the wilderness and never look back, but Morwen's hand on my shoulder stopped me. You can't run from this, he said quietly. Whatever you are, whatever power you carry, it's awake now, and the world will not let you ignore it. Alara crossed the room, her hands trembling as she pulled a small pouch from her cloak. I brought this, she said, pressing it into my hands. Bread, dried fruit, a few coins, it's not much, but… She stopped, her voice breaking. Please, find out what you are, find out why this is happening, because if you don't, Valen will burn everything to ash trying to kill you. I looked down at the pouch, then at her, then at Morwen. The humming in my bones grew louder, a low thrum that seemed to sync with my heartbeat. I didn't know what I was, but I knew I couldn't stay here. Not when every moment I remained put others in danger. There's a place, Morwen said, his voice urgent. North of the city in the foothills, an old monastery abandoned for decades. The monks used to keep records, histories that predate the empire. If there's an answer, it might be there. I nodded, my throat tight. Thank you, I said, the words inadequate but all I had. Alara squeezed my hand, her grip fierce, and Morwen pressed a small wooden charm into my palm, a carved tree, its branches tangled. For guidance, he said, may you find what you seek. As I slipped out the back door and into the night, the smell of smoke already thickening in the air, I heard the whispers again, welcome home, true king, but this time they didn't feel like a promise. They felt like a warning. The journey north took 3 days, and I spent them jumping at every shadow, every snapping twig. I kept to the forest trails, avoiding the main roads where Valen's patrols would be thickest, and slept in hollow trees or beneath overhangs, wrapped in my torn cloak. The pouch Alara had given me lasted 2 days before the bread ran out, and I supplemented it with wild berries and stream water, my stomach cramping with hunger. The humming never stopped. It pulsed in my wrists, my chest, the base of my skull, a constant reminder of whatever had happened on that scaffold. I tried to ignore it, but at night, when exhaustion finally dragged me under, I dreamed of molten metal and bowing wood, of voices whispering in a language I didn't know but somehow understood. You are the hinge, they said, the door that will not close. On the 3rd day, I reached the foothills. The monastery sat perched on a rocky outcrop, its stone walls weathered and cracked, its bell tower crumbling. Ivy crawled up the sides, and the courtyard was overgrown with weeds, but the gate still stood, its iron bars twisted with age. I pushed it open, the hinges shrieking, and stepped inside. The air was different here, cooler, heavier, as if the stones themselves held memory. I wandered through the courtyard, past a dry fountain and a collapsed stable until I found the main hall. The door was ajar, and I slipped inside, my eyes adjusting to the gloom. The hall was vast, its ceiling vaulted and lined with faded frescoes. Rows of wooden benches stretched toward an altar at the far end, and shelves lined the walls, filled with dusty books and scrolls. I approached the altar, my footsteps echoing, and saw a carved inscription in the stone, "Truth bends the world, lies break it." I ran my fingers over the words, and the humming surged so loud I gasped. My vision blurred, and for a moment I saw something. A man standing where I stood, his hand pressed to the altar, his face lined with grief. He wore a crown of iron, and his eyes were the color of storm clouds. Behind him, a woman wept, her hands bound. "Forgive me," he said, his voice cracking. "But I will not let them take this from us." The vision dissolved, and I staggered back, my heart racing. The altar was empty, the hall silent. But I knew, with a certainty that shook me to my core, that the man I'd seen was the last of the bloodline Morwen had spoken of, the king who'd been erased. I spent the next hours combing through the shelves, pulling down scrolls and books, their pages brittle with age. Most were records of daily life, accounts of harvests, births, marriages, but one tome, bound in black leather, caught my eye. Its cover was unmarked, but when I opened it, the pages glowed faintly, the ink shimmering like liquid silver. It was a history written in a hand so precise it looked printed. It told of a kingdom before the empire, a realm governed not by force but by accord, a pact between the rulers and the land itself. The kings of that line could speak to stone and steel, to fire and water, because they were chosen by the earth, bound to it through a ritual as old as memory. But the first emperor, a warlord named Kale, had broken that pact. He'd killed the last king, burned the royal family, and built his empire on the ashes. The book didn't say how he'd done it, but it hinted at betrayal, a servant who'd poisoned the king's wine, a guard who'd opened the gates. Kale had hunted down every remnant of the bloodline, burning their homes, scattering their names to the wind. But he'd missed one, a child hidden by a midwife, smuggled out of the capital and raised in obscurity. I turned the page, my hands trembling, and found a drawing, a family tree, its branches sprawling across 2 pages. At the top was the last king, his name scratched out. Below him, a single line descended, unbroken, through generations of farmers, scribes, and tradespeople. At the bottom, written in fresh ink, was a name I didn't recognize, but next to it, in the margins, someone had added a note: last known descendant, location unknown. I stared at the note, my mind reeling. Could it be me? Was I the child who'd been hidden, the bloodline's final thread? But that was impossible. I'd known my parents, a baker and a seamstress, both dead of fever when I was 10. Corwin had taken me in, raised me, taught me to read and write. There was no royal blood in me, no ancient power. But then I thought of the axe melting, the chains breaking, the scaffold bowing. I thought of the humming, the visions, the whispers that wouldn't stop. And I realized with a cold dread that settled in my gut that it didn't matter whether I believed it. The world believed it. Valen believed it, and that made me a threat. A sound outside, boot heels on stone, jerked me from my thoughts. I shoved the book into my satchel and crept to the window. In the courtyard below, a dozen soldiers fanned out, their armor glinting in the fading light. At their head was a man in a crimson cloak, his face shadowed by a hood. He raised a hand and the soldiers stopped, their swords drawn. "Search every room," the man said, his voice clipped and cold. "He's here, I can feel it." I didn't recognize the voice, but the certainty in it sent a chill down my spine. I backed away from the window, looking for another exit, but the hall had only one door. I was trapped. The soldiers entered the monastery, their footsteps growing louder. I pressed myself against the wall, my mind racing. If they found me, I'd hang, or worse, they'd drag me back to the capital and make a spectacle of my death. But if I ran, where would I go? The forest was vast, but Valen's men were trained hunters. I wouldn't last a day. The door to the hall burst open, and I bolted, sprinting toward the altar. My foot caught on a loose stone, and I stumbled, slamming into the altar with enough force to crack it. The humming exploded, a roar that filled my skull, and the altar split down the middle, revealing a staircase leading down into darkness. I didn't hesitate. I plunged into the stairwell, the soldiers' shouts echoing behind me, and descended into the unknown. The stairwell spiraled down, the air growing colder with every step, until I emerged into a chamber carved from living rock. Torches lined the walls, their flames flickering without smoke, and in the center of the room stood a stone dais, its surface etched with symbols I didn't recognize. The humming was deafening here, a vibration that rattled my teeth, and I pressed my hands to my ears, gasping. The chamber was empty except for a single object resting on the dais, a crown of iron, its surface dull and unadorned. It looked ancient, as if it had been waiting here for centuries, and when I stepped closer, the humming shifted, becoming almost musical, a harmony that resonated in my chest. I reached out, my fingers trembling, and touched the crown. The world tilted. I saw everything, every moment, every choice, every thread of fate that had led me here. I saw the midwife smuggling a child out of the burning palace, her hands shaking as she pressed a wooden charm into the baby's blanket. I saw Corwin finding me half-starved on the steps of his shop, his eyes softening as he lifted me into his arms. I saw the Emperor, young and ambitious, standing over the last king's body, blood on his hands and triumph in his eyes. And I saw the future, 2 paths branching like a river. In one, I put on the crown and became what the Whispers called me, a king, a rallying point for those who'd suffered under Valen's rule. I saw rebellion, war, the capital burning, and myself standing alone on a throne built of ash. In the other, I left the crown where it lay and walked away, a nobody once more, fading into obscurity while the empire ground on. Both paths were terrible, both demanded sacrifice. But only one offered hope, a fragile, uncertain hope, built on the belief that truth could still bend the world. The soldiers burst into the chamber, their swords drawn, and the man in the crimson cloak stepped forward, pulling back his hood. It was the young guard from the scaffold, the one who'd steadied me, and his face was twisted with something I couldn't name: grief, anger, shame. "Step away from the crown," he said, his voice hoarse. "Please, don't make me kill you." I looked at him, then at the crown, then at the soldiers surrounding me. My hands shook, and I thought of Corwin, of Alara, of Morwen, and the people in the lower wards whose homes had burned because of me. I thought of the bloodline that had been erased, the pact that had been broken, the empire built on lies, and I made my choice. I lifted the crown and placed it on my head. The world exploded. The torches flared, their flames roaring to the ceiling, and the stone dais cracked, light pouring from the fissures. The soldiers stumbled back, their weapons clattering to the ground, and the young guard fell to his knees, his face pale. "I didn't want this," I said, my voice ringing through the chamber. "I never wanted this, but if I walk away, nothing changes. Valen keeps his throne and people keep suffering, so I'll carry this burden even if it breaks me, because someone has to." The crown grew warm, then hot, and the humming became a roar, a voice that wasn't mine but came from somewhere deep inside me. The accord is renewed. The pact is reborn. The chamber shook and the walls began to glow, symbols lighting up one by one. The young guard looked up at me, tears streaming down his face. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I didn't know, I know," I said, and I meant it. "But now we have to make it right." The ceiling cracked and sunlight poured in, blinding and beautiful. The soldiers fled and the young guard remained, his hands pressed to the ground, his body trembling. I stepped off the dais, the crown heavy on my head, and extended my hand. "What's your name?" I asked. He looked up, his eyes red-rimmed. "Torin." "Then come with me, Torin," I said, "because I can't do this alone." He hesitated, then took my hand, his grip firm, and together we climbed out of the chamber into the light and toward a future neither of us could predict. The monastery became our base, and within weeks, word of the returned king spread like wildfire. People came from the lower wards, from the outlying villages, from the farms and mines that Valen had bled dry. They brought stories of injustice, of families torn apart, of children who'd starved while the emperor feasted. And they brought hope, fragile and fierce, that maybe, just maybe, things could change. I didn't feel like a king. I felt like a fraud, a boy playing dress-up in a crown that didn't fit. But Torin stayed by my side, his loyalty unwavering, and slowly, others joined us. Alara arrived one morning, her cart loaded with supplies, her smile bright despite the shadows under her eyes. Father Morwen came a week later, his weathered face calm, his presence a steady anchor. We didn't wage war, not yet. Instead, we did something Valen hadn't anticipated. We listened. We went to the villages, sat in their squares, and asked what they needed. Clean water, fair taxes, justice for those who'd been wronged. Small things, practical things that the empire had ignored in its pursuit of glory, and people responded. They began to trust us, to believe that we were different. Farmers brought us grain. Blacksmiths forged weapons. Mothers taught their children our names, whispered them like prayers. Valen, of course, didn't take it well. He sent armies, assassins, proclamations declaring me a heretic and a charlatan. But every time his soldiers marched on us, the earth itself seemed to resist. Roads collapsed, bridges crumbled, rivers flooded. The pact was real, and it recognized me as its keeper. One night, as I sat by the fire in the monastery courtyard, Torin joined me, his expression thoughtful. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked. "Putting on the crown?" I stared into the flames, the crown resting on the ground beside me. "Every day," I admitted. "But I think about what would have happened if I hadn't, and I know I made the right choice." He nodded slowly. "My father was one of the guards who burned the royal family," he said quietly. "He told me once before he died that he'd had nightmares ever since. That he could still hear them screaming." He looked at me, his eyes bright. "I think he'd be glad to know I'm here, making amends." I reached over and squeezed his shoulder, unable to speak. Alara appeared, carrying a tray of bread and cheese. "You two look far too serious," she said, setting the tray down. "Eat, you'll need your strength." I smiled, the tension easing. "What for?" She grinned. "Tomorrow we march on the capital." My stomach dropped. "Alara, not to fight," she said quickly. "To talk. Valen's losing support. His own nobles are starting to question him. If we can get an audience, if we can show them that we're not the enemy, we might be able to end this without bloodshed." I looked at Torin, who nodded. "It's risky," he said, "but it's the right move." I picked up the crown, its weight familiar now, and placed it back on my head. "Then we go," I said, "together." The march took a week, and by the time we reached the capital, our numbers had swollen to thousands. We didn't carry weapons, only banners, white and plain, and voices raised in song. The city gates opened, not because we forced them, but because the people inside demanded it. Mothers, merchants, soldiers who'd grown tired of Valen's cruelty. They flooded the streets, joining our procession, and by the time we reached the palace square, the emperor's own guards had laid down their arms. Valen stood on the balcony, his face pale, his hands clenched on the railing. He looked smaller than I remembered, diminished by fear. "I didn't come to take your throne," I called up to him, my voice carrying across the square. "I came to offer you a choice: step down and help us rebuild, or stay and watch everything you've built crumble to dust." He stared at me for a long moment, his jaw working. Then slowly he straightened, his expression hardening. "You think you've won," he said, "but you're just a boy with a crown. You'll learn soon enough that ruling is more than ideals and speeches." "Maybe," I said. "But at least I'll try." He turned and disappeared into the palace, and I didn't chase him. The work ahead would be long, difficult, and uncertain. But as I looked out at the crowd, at Torin, at Alara, at Morwen, at the faces of people who dared to hope, I felt the crown settle, not as a burden but as a promise. The empire had been built on lies. Now we would rebuild it on truth. And that, I thought, was a beginning worth fighting for.